This is TechSNAP, episode 405, recorded June 11th, 2019. Hello, and welcome to TechSNAP, Jupiter Broadcasting Systems, Network, and Administration podcast. My name is Wes, and I'm very pleased to be joined with Mr. Jim Salter. Welcome to the show, Jim.
What's up, Wes?
Now, as we sit here on June Patch Tuesday, there's one update in particular that everyone has been talking about, and I think with good reason. Of course, that's BlueKeep. BlueKeep is a vulnerability in Microsoft's implementation of the remote desktop protocol, and it's particularly troubling because it's pre-authentication and it doesn't require user interaction. This means it could be highly wormable and reminds many experts of the WannaCry attack from just a few years ago. Recent estimates put the number of vulnerable machines at possibly over 1 million, and that's why it's particularly important today to pay attention to your updates.
So BlueKeep is basically just the latest vulnerability that has hit us as a result of the Shadow Brokers leak of the NSA's toolkits. The last one was WannaCry, and BlueKeep is another of the same, but BlueKeep attacks the Remote Desktop Services Protocol. The same service that you use to remote control your machines, because you know the username and password, can allow an arbitrary attacker to control those same machines without username, password, or anything else if they understand a particular vulnerability in the Remote Desktop Protocol that BlueKeep exploits. In particular, if you have Remote Desktop Protocol forwarded out to the internet, if you've got port 3389 forwarded through your firewall so that you've got this nice, convenient way to control your desktop from wherever you happen to be, stop that. Most folks don't have the best Windows passwords in the world, and there's too much going on with that protocol and the way that it ties natively to Windows' own very complex authentication schemes, and it's just not something you should be comfortable with touching the internet. If you want to RDP the machine that's sitting in your house, don't forward a RDP through your firewall. Forward, a VPN through the firewall, OpenVPN or WireGuard, or if you're really old school, maybe one of the old IPsec VPNs, and connect over that, and then access your RDP that way. But don't just let everybody in the world have a whack directly at RDP on your machine. It's not good hygiene.
You might also just want to disable remote desktop services if that's something you're not using or are using some other solution for. No reason to leave it running, waiting to be attacked.
Well, to be fair, remote desktop services is not going to be enabled by default on Windows 7 or Windows 10. I don't believe it was on XP either. It's not going to be on unless you turned it on.
And I imagine people are worried about, large installations of Windows sitting perhaps installed in business locations that may be vulnerable and just haven't seen many updates. I noted this was one of those dangerous enough releases that Microsoft gave free patches out for some of their older, unsupported, or only supported if you pay us lots of money OSs, like Windows XP.
I said a little while ago that, remote desktop services is not going to be running unless you specifically enabled it, because it's not a service that's on by default. But I will say, those of you who administer fairly sizable offices, maybe you've got 50, 100, 200 desktops, this is something that you really should not just have group policy automatically enabling remote desktop services on all the desktops in your office because it's convenient. When you have vulnerabilities like this with RDP, you're not only exposing yourself to problems over the internet, and you can't necessarily just say, oh, well, I'm fine because, I've got this on all my machines, but nobody can touch it from the internet. You're also potentially exposing yourself to, worm-related problems. Maybe one of your users falls for a phishing scam. The phishing scam downloads a payload that includes a worm that targets, something like Eternal BlueKeep. And, now you have an issue that one machine that got infected may very easily infect all 200 desktops on your network. And what could have started out as a minor problem becomes an absolutely critical one. And, let's face it, most of your users are probably not going to be using RDP at all. Even if they are using RDP, most of your users are probably only going to really need to use it to actually remote control their machine from home. They're not necessarily going to need to remote control one machine across the office, from another machine. And so again, you can limit your vulnerability to these kind of worms tremendously by using Windows Firewall and say, hey, if I don't expect one user to be using RDP to control another user's machine across the office, but I do need those users to be able to control their machines from home, well, use Windows Firewall to only expose RDP to the corporate VPN, not to the LAN.
Oh yeah, this is a great example of how some, sane, thoughtful network architecture, firewall, and security policies can greatly reduce some of your attack surface.
Now, Wes, all those words don't belong together in the same sentence. I mean, like sane, corporate, network, security.
Yeah, you're right. And unfortunately, that's why this is such a big problem. Even the NSA, normally very quiet, especially on things linked back to them, they put out a notice as well advising people that, you really should patch. And it's again because of what you hit on, Jim. This thing's wormable. We talk about lots of different vulnerabilities and attacks that, require some sort of extra service to be running with a really bad configuration, or maybe the user has to interact with the service. In this case, if you have this remote desktop service available and running on your Windows machine, you don't have to do anything else. And what could have been a tiny little attack, suddenly, you've got access. It pairs with all the other instances where we see various CVEs fly by, and maybe you're not too worried about it because it says, the attacker needs access. They need to be your user, they need local access or to have an account or access to an account on your box, and only then can they do something like privilege escalation. Well, with something like BlueKeep, once they're in, all the rest of those vulnerabilities, they're fair game.
And one reason that the NSA is going to be so interested in this one, Wes, where you are going to find a lot of older machines that don't get patches applied regularly that absolutely have RDP exposed, right?
Hopefully not government machines.
Yeah, absolutely government machines, but that wasn't exactly where I was headed with that. In particular, you're going to see a lot of that in industrial control machines and, in machines that control the power grid. So, your issue with a really wormable exploit like this that targets something like RDP, that's just tailor-made for taking down a power company.
Right? I mean, how many of us have seen really old appliances or devices? They're controlled from a machine over some sort of horrible parallel port that requires an ancient operating system long out of support to operate. And, there's just bad economic incentives for these sorts of situations. Sitting there running Windows XP unpatched for a decade on, waiting to be attacked. If that wasn't bad enough, well, there's another great reason you really shouldn't be exposing RDP to the internet, and that's a botnet called GoldBrute.
BlueKeep is already a problem, and it's a vulnerability that allows anybody to take over your machine that has remote desktop services exposed. GoldBrute doesn't bother with technical vulnerabilities. It's just trying to brute force every RDP server it can find exposed to the internet. And, this is actually the first and foremost reason I always advise anybody, especially all of my clients, look, you can't expose RDP directly to the internet because no matter what you do, if you have a substantial number of users, a lot of them are going to have really, really stupid passwords. They're going to reuse that passwords with websites that get compromised. They're going to try to get around your password strength rules by just, tacking a 1 on the end and calling it a day. All of these really, really poor security hygiene habits that your users have, if you expose RDP, you're exposing all of those to the internet. And that's just something that you don't want to do precisely because of things like GoldBrute. If one of your users has, password 1 as their password, and you've got RDP for any machine they can log into exposed to the internet, then GoldBrute's going to find that, it's going to break into it, and it's going to let its masters know, hey, you can log in right over here. Just type in password 1.
Ah, dang it, Jim. That's my favorite password. I better go change some things.
You got to put a bang on the end, right?
Oh, that's right. That's the trick.
Now, by sharp contrast, if you need your users to be able to remote control machines over the internet, and you've done what I recommended, which is, you give them VPN access and you let them RDP over the VPN. Now these folks running this GoldBrute botnet, instead of trying to brute force passwords that users type in every single day, they're left trying to, brute force a 2048-bit key. And that's just not going to happen.
Now, it might be worth noting here, RDP is not all bad, and really even BlueKeep, it's not a flaw in RDP itself. It's really in Microsoft's implementation. And Jim, you and I were talking earlier. You actually like RDP a lot, right?
Yeah, I love RDP. Honestly, I'd love to hate it because it's Microsoft, and well, you know me. But the fact is, it's the most efficient over the network remote control protocol I've ever used. It's considerably better than VNC, not that that's saying much, but it's even still significantly faster than Spice, the newer protocol that came out of Red Hat for doing control of mostly of virtual machines, although it can be used for anything RDP can. But there's always significantly higher latency when I have to remote control machines with anything other than Windows RDP. Honestly, even when I was experimenting with using XRDP to proxy VNC on an Ubuntu machine to remote desktop so that I could use RDP to actually get access to an Ubuntu desktop, back in the day. I mean, even that works like gangbusters. The real issue that, I keep wanting to hammer on until people do not expose RDP to the internet is it's not so much the remote desktop part of it at all, it's the authentication. Again, you've got issues with, your users and their stupid passwords. And also just, I don't know if RDP is ever really going to have the kind of security attention paid to it. And it's certainly not likely ever to be as modular and clean as, for example, the SSH code base.
Yeah, it does seem to unfortunately pair with some of the, the cultures of the user base, and SSH is nice, designed by people who, take security seriously. And if you've got things set up right, you're using keys.
Also, I think it's probably important to note that, when you're using SSH to remotely control a machine, it's not quite the same as RDP, where you've got this, giant monolithic thing where, the one library does all this stuff. Ultimately at the end of it, SSH, it really is more designed like a VPN tunnel, and then you can do other things on top of it. But at its heart, SSH really isn't intended to be much more than, a way to reliably and securely move bytes from one end of the network to the other. Everything else gets layered on top of that. By contrast, remote desktop, it's a great big everything all in one thing. Like, you're not going to tunnel some other traffic over RDP, really.
There's another complicating factor when it comes to keeping systems safe from vulnerabilities like BlueKeep. And unfortunately, that's users' attitudes to updates. Especially recently, there's a view of Windows 10 and other Windows updates being, let's just say, a bit dicey. So there's been a proliferation of guides and updates and how-tos either to disable Windows updates or just information about which updates you should or shouldn't apply, at least by that author's reasoning. Jim, I'm curious what you think. What's your policy on your serious systems around updates, automatic, unattended updates? What's the sane policy here?
The sane policy is very clear. It's apply your freaking updates. Don't delay them. Sure, certainly don't disable them. You need your updates. This is not 1999 anymore. It's 2019, and anything that can be touched over the internet, basically the entire world is trying to attack it, always. I am not the biggest fan of, Microsoft's QA program with their updates. I think that they could do a tremendously better job than they do, but at the end of the day, there is far, far more risk in leaving your systems unpatched to real exploits and vulnerabilities that are out there than there is to, anything that's coming out of Redmond's security upgrade queue. All of my machines, desktop or server, they have automatic updates turned on, period. I don't have any delays. I don't have, no updates unless the administrator has approved it, via this WSUS server. None of that crap. No. If you know there's a vulnerability, I want it patched, and I want it patched now.
So what would you say to those administrators concerned for the safety and uptime? If you do have concerns, as you said, about some of the QA of the updates, aren't you risking some of your business operations?
You're risking your business operations no matter what you do. Life is a risk. The only question is, what's riskier? Risking leaving your systems unpatched, or, risking that you'll have a severe problem out of an update that came out of Redmond on a patch Tuesday. And your risks are tremendously worse leaving the system unpatched than they are applying, the updates. Now, I'm not just kind of saying this out of the blue. There are certainly admins out there who have to deal with more systems than I do. But with that said, I'm the direct line of support for somewhere around 500 Windows VMs and desktop machines. And, somewhere probably around 150 or 200, Linux or BSD machines. And I do absolutely encounter some problems with updates that went bad and screw up machines. Out of that pool of 500 plus Windows machines, there's probably 1 or 2 machines per year that effectively get bricked by a bad update. And I have to, roll them back to an earlier snapshot or what have you. In some cases, there might be another way around it, but it's generally just going to be easier for me to just roll back, to the last good snapshot before the updates came in and problem solved, rather than like the old days when you might have to spend anywhere from half an hour to, sometimes 8 or 10 hours trying to figure out how to undo the damage a really bad update did. But again, this is once or twice a year out of 500 plus machines. And that's just the amount of damage that I deal with from security problems, even with security upgrades getting applied, is considerably heavier than that. So here's the thing, if you're a home user and, you've got one Windows desktop machine that is like basically this thing is your whole world, like, all your games are on it. Maybe it's how you watch Netflix, it's got, this and that and the other, and it's just going to be an enormous nightmare to you if you have to, format and reinstall that thing because you had a really, really bad update. Look, I get that. If you want to be paranoid about that, you can maybe think about like, oh, well, I'll wait a day or two or maybe a week or two before I apply updates. But the thing is, once you introduce that delay, once you introduce that point of failure in the process of applying security upgrades, you had better take that seriously. That is your job now. If you do what almost every admin out there eventually does, who is, inserted themselves into this pipeline as a single point of failure that prevents updates being applied, eventually that's exactly what you're going to do. You're going to put it off, and next thing you know, it'll be 9 months since the last time you patched, and some worm comes out that's exploiting a 6-month-old vulnerability, and guess what? You're still vulnerable, and you get nailed. Don't do that. Don't be that guy.
Exactly, right? That was the whole reason we've been pushing for more automation, is to get rid of those little human failures that are basically inevitable.
Yeah, and I will state also that of those Windows updates that go like really drastically bad and need to get rolled back or whatever. Now, in my case, I am usually just rolling those back, using a snapshot system. If you're a business admin and we're talking about your servers, there's no excuse anymore. You should be able to do that. You should have virtualized servers in your infrastructure. You should not be running Windows Server on the bare metal. And if you aren't confident of your ability to roll back to an hourly snapshot that you should have at least 24 of on hand, if you don't feel confident that you can do that without issue in 5 or 10 minutes from when you sit down at the machine, you need to rework your infrastructure. You're behind the times. There's really no excuse for that anymore. It doesn't have to cost you a ton of money. If you don't want to buy infrastructure that does that, you can go from the ground open source and not spend a penny if that's what you're looking for. But you need to have that. Don't play romper room with it. On the other hand, if you're talking about your desktop machines, now, again, on the business side, ideally, you should be able to image these things. It should not be the end of the world for you to re-image somebody's desktop or laptop and have them, basically up and rolling again with no more than half an hour to an hour of work. If you're a home user, well, again, things may get a little bit more difficult, but I should also mention that although I just roll back a machine to an earlier snapshot when a Windows update fails, if it's a user's desktop that gets nailed, the first line of defense is going to be, and Windows makes this very available and very easy. It says, hey, there's a big problem. We need to roll this back. Luckily, we created a system restore point before applying this update, so we're just going to roll you back to that system restore point. Now, that's not always perfect either. Every once in a while, that also screws up. That is something I have seen happen. It's happened, I think, twice in all the machines that I manage over the last 10 years. That, an update that was bad, it was not possible to just use the system restore point, and I had to nuke that user's laptop or desktop. But again, the risk there, it's just penny ante compared to the risk of letting an attacker into your system.
You're really spot on. You do have to, in 2019, you should be designing and architecting your infrastructure and your systems, knowing that you need to be patching your systems, right? Like that's just part of it, even if you aren't subject to any sort of compliance or security auditing or testing. That's just being responsible. And I think we have a sort of cognitive bias where enabling updates or running the updates, that's an action that you're taking. So you can sort of easily see the risk. It's a little harder to see the risk of not doing anything, but it's real. And once a worm gets into your systems, it's going to move way faster than you can.
Absolutely. And, another thing that you probably need to do is when you listen or, read people talking about this topic, you really have to actually think about what they're saying and does this make sense, or are they just telling me what I want to hear? When we were putting together the notes for this show, Wes went out and he found a couple of articles on Forbes and on Computer World that were just, very dramatic and, Windows 10 updates are ugly. And here's how you literally Forbes has an article that says, here's how to stay safe by disabling automatic updates. Now, if that is not just pandering to what they expect the user want to hear and not being willing to give good advice, I don't know what is. And, another one on Computer World, this guy, Woody on Windows, it's time to block Windows automatic updating. And, the guy shills for his own website. What is it? WoodyOnWindows.com or something? No, AskWoody.com. He shills for his own website, in that article on Computer World where he says it's time to block Windows automatic updating. And you go there and he's basically devoted an entire website to saying updates suck and you shouldn't apply them. Dude, what? No.
Turns out the internet is often wrong, or at least it lacks context, right? Applying updates, the policy around it. It should be something that either you're thinking about or you just let happen. And if you do have a lot of systems out there that you feel anxious about updating, that's probably a sign that, you haven't documented how those systems are constructed well enough. Either they don't have enough backups or they can't easily be rebuilt from source or from documentation. Those are weak points, and whether it's an update that bites you or a hard drive that goes down, something's going to fail. You have to plan for it. Be redundant, be resilient to that, and patch your systems.
And no, a liberal application of thieves' oil will not keep you safe from Eternal Blue. I mean, this is just anti-vax woo all over again, right?
Exactly. Now, speaking of backups, I noticed over on your Twitter, Jim, at JRSSNet, you've built something of a sexy new backup server yourself recently.
Yeah, it's my new little toy. I'm really happy with that build. So I've got a backup server that all my machines in the house replicate to hourly, and I've got a few things outside the house that uses an offsite disaster recovery and replicate to it over the internet. And it's always been a pretty low key box. I had this god awful little dual core Pentium G in a mid tower case, sitting on a shelf. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't need to be. It just did that simple job. But, I was like, I want to have a little bit more expandability. I want this to be a little bit modern. I want it to not suck quite so much. And I found this really cool rack mount chassis that I had not used before. I use a lot of Supermicro chassis, and they're high quality, they're great, but they're super duper heavy, and they're not inexpensive. Let's put it that way. But Rosewill has this case with 12 hot swap bays in it for $200. And I was like, yeah, I got to give that a shot. So I bought this Rosewill case, and I just transplanted the crappy old Pentium G in there, and I wanted to light up a pair of new 10 terabyte HGST disks. And that's when I remembered a problem that I had forgotten about with that Pentium G. I had an extra pair of old 1 terabyte hard drives in it because there was a bug in its BIOS that would not allow it to boot off of drives any larger than 1 or 2 terabytes. I had a pair of 4 terabytes in there, and it could access them fine, but it wouldn't boot from them. So when I wanted to pull those 1Ts and, just have the 4 terabytes, the 10 terabytes in there, I couldn't get the thing to boot. So I was like, all right, there's my sign. I need to actually buy decent gear here. And it was really good timing for it because I've really been wanting to experiment with AMD's Ryzen processor, which is, all of the AMD Ryzens are able to address ECC RAM.
Yes.
Yeah, up until recently, unfortunately, it's really been kind of a crap show because very few motherboards supported it. And some other motherboards, they would boot with the ECC in there, but they wouldn't actually use the ECC features. So you've gone out, you spent the extra money for ECC RAM, but it's not actually doing the whole error correcting checksum thing. But ASRock finally released an ASRock rack motherboard. Not too cheap, but not too expensive at $269, and it will actually address ECC RAM and says so. It's not just like an afterthought. They actually market it as accepting ECC, so there's no real crapshoot there. So I said, the heck with it. Built a new system, Ryzen 7 2700, 32 gigs of DDR4 ECC, and that board. And it's been great. The chassis turns out to be really quiet and livable. It's got 3 120 millimeter fans, for intake right behind the 12 drive bays. And it's got 2 80 millimeter exhaust fans. And I haven't even really felt the need to replace any of them with quieter fans. It's definitely not whisper quiet, but, all the noise is that nice, consistent, really low pitched whoosh. There's none of that nasty buzzing or, whining or rattling going on. So
good, clean, white noise. And as long as you're, not recording a podcast right next to it, you'll probably be fine.
Well, Wes, I am recording a podcast right next to it. It's about 3 feet away from the mic right now.
That is pretty impressive. Now, how much did you actually have to spend here?
Well, so, the system itself, without an expander card in it to light up all 12 bays, the motherboard itself is enough to light up the first 8 out of the 12 bays. And with just that, you're looking at about $750. By the time you add the 8-port controller and a pair of SFF breakout cables, we still have not broke $1,000. We're sitting at $939 plus a power supply, so you're pretty much right at $1,000. Now that doesn't include discs; that's just the machine itself. But I actually kind of like to price machines out that way because everybody has a different idea about how big a disc or how fast a disc they want to buy and put in there. But you certainly got all the options you could ever want with 12 bays to play with. Oh, and I forgot to mention one of the best parts. One of the things that really annoys me with those big, heavy, expensive Supermicro boxes, I don't really want to buy the ones that only have the 2.5-inch bays that fit SSDs because the minute that you do that, somebody's going to come up with a need and you're like, I wish I could put one of those nice, big, cheap 10 terabyte Rust drives in there, and you can't. So I always get the ones that have 3.5-inch bays. Now, you can fit either size drive in there, but with most cases that have hot swap, you're going to need an adapter to actually mount your 2.5-inch disk into this adapter that then goes into the tray that then will plug into the system.
I've definitely had to do that myself on many systems.
Yeah, and it's more of a pain in the butt on the hot swap systems because most of the we're talking like 99% of the adapters that you see out there sold that way, they don't actually line up the SATA and the power ports in quite the right place as though it really were a 3.5-inch drive. It's relatively close, but relatively close is fine for when you're, plugging a cable into it. It will not do whatsoever when you're sliding it into a hot swap bay where everything has to be, millimeter precision. Anyway, that has been a giant pain in my butt with those Supermicro chassis. This little Rosewill chassis Now, I will say, the trays, they're only ABS plastic. They're not metal like the ones in the Super Micro, but they have mounting holes that fit either 2.5 or 3.5 inch drives natively. So whatever you want to put in there, you put it in there, you bolt it in, you slide it into the case, and you're good. No adapters needed.
That is beautiful. If you want to check out some of the pictures, well, you can find a link to Jim's Twitter and that tweet over at our show notes, techsnap.systems/405. If you would like to subscribe or contact us, you can find links there too, techsnap.systems. If you'd like some other fine podcasts to listen to, well, head on over to jupiterbroadcasting.com. There you'll find many other shows. In particular, go check out the new BSD Now. We're something of a sister show, as Alan Jude, TechSNAP progenitor, well, he's the host over on BSD Now. They've just reformatted the show over to an audio-based format, and it is great. Now's a great time to check it out. And if you'd like a little something extra in your week, well, check out the Friday stream. Episode 6 is now available at fridaystream.com/6. That's going to do it for this episode of TechSNAP. Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everybody.